Welcome back to the Chronicle, the official film podcast for the people's movies. And if movies is your thing, you are in the right place. I am Paul. I am your host and editor of the people's movies. Welcome to episode 40. And as ever, it's Clotilde and Paul who is the co-host. How are you, Clotilde?
I'm good. How are you?
I am doing good. How was the new year for you?
It was good. I'm not a big fan of New Year's, but I enjoyed it. What about you?
I was working. I was working on New Year's Day.
What you did say?
Yeah, there was flights, but have you recovered for that last double episode that it did of the best of the worst, which is
I think
available?
so. It was a fun one. It was so long.
It was, and ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't listened to it yet, you can find it at the People's Movies website. Look under the podcast section of the website, or go on to the Podbean website, where you will find on the post it this episode 40 we're doing. So for this week, Clotilde, we're going to do two, and it's two films that are out in the cinemas. One you might have to look a little bit for, and the two films are Nosferatu and 2073. And the first film for this week of episode 40 of the Chronicle is Robert Eggers' Nosferatu. It is a film that every cinephile has been talking about. It came out just before Christmas in America, or around Christmas in America. American cinephiles and a lot of cinephiles in the world have been talking about this film. So here, it's our turn to talk about it. And Nosferatu is set in the fictional town of Wisborg in Germany, and the year is 1838. And this film stars Nicholas Hoult. He plays Thomas Sutter. Lilly-Rose Depp, the daughter of Johnny Depp, she plays Ellen Hunter, his wife. The man of the moment, who's in virtually everything these days, that's Aaron Taylor-Johnson. He plays Friedrich Harden, and his wife, who's Anna Harden, is played by Emma Corrin. There's a few other actors in there. There's Simon McBurney, Ralph Eason, who plays Dr. Sivers, the brilliant Willem Dafoe, who plays Professor Albert Elbach von Franz, and obviously there's Bill Skarsgård as Count Orlok. So Thomas is played by Nicholas Hoult, as I said. He's just started a new job in his hometown, and he's a local real estate agent. His boss, Knock, who's played by Simon McBurney, gives him a task to head to Romania and into the Carpathian Mountains for their new reclusive client, who just happens to be Count Orlok. And Knock wants Thomas to head to Orlok's current home, which is a castle up in the Carpathian Mountains, to get all the paperwork signed in time for Orlok to come to Wisborg, and so obviously can get to start selling the castle that Orlok actually lives in at the moment. So obviously Thomas takes a job. It is going to take a very long time to get there, but also at the same time, we do learn early that Thomas is just newly married Ellen, as I said, played by Lilly-Rose Depp. So once he takes a job to get that paperwork signed and delivered, and Thomas is very unaware of the mystery surrounding who Orlok is and why he was actually chosen to do this job. He's unaware that he's actually an ancient vampire who actually he's got plans not just for the population of Wisborg, but also his new wife, Ellen. This one, I liked, they played along with that sort of sinking dread and uneasiness of the mythology in Orlok. How he's always, anytime we do get to sort of see him, he's lurking in the shadows. I also liked how his name is feared and not spoken with the locals that Thomas meets. But obviously he's still unknown in the town of Wisborg, and how no one actually knows who he is. We even, at the beginning, as just before the credits started, we get a little taster of how powerful Orlok actually is when we meet Ellen, who just seems to be transfixed and hypnotised by Orlok's seductive dulcet tones, as you like to say, because when you meet him, he's making some sort of ancient tongue. We're sort of unaware of exactly when that is. Is it pre-marriage with Thomas, or is it during then? But it's more and more when Thomas is sort of travelling to see Orlok, he gets to become sort of more fearful of who he is and who he's about to meet and what he can expect when he arrives at his home at the castle. So when he does finally meet him, I like how he's sort of frozen with fear and how he's constantly saying the wrong thing. And Orlok just seems to get more angrier with Thomas's insolence, if you like to call it. The thing about Nosferatu, and I think you'll agree with me, well, I don't know if you will agree with me, Clotilde, it's not a jump scare horror, it is a gothic horror. And if anyone doesn't know what gothic horror is, it plays on this atmospheric tone, the darkness, the decay, the sort of lingering sense of dread. And there's also a lot of supernatural tone to it as well. And in Nosferatu, it's the vampires, and there's a lot of play on the morality, the death, and revenge, and even sexual violence, which this film, if I like to say, does have. And gothic horror does like to play on the metaphors, especially with its characters, and obviously how it teases their temptations. I think what Nosferatu does is it reminds us what lies beneath society, the turmoil, the evil that lies await to seduce us, and those things that lie below the surface. They promise something better, but do they actually deliver that? And Orlok, he's got that's probably why we meet Orlok. He's sort of very predatory, and we don't really see him until the very, very end. And when we do see him, or really when we do hear him, he's in the shadows or in the distance. I don't know if you agree with us, Clotilde. I'll say this little bit and then I'll let you go on, let you say what you think of it. I think it could possibly, because Nosferatu has a lot of contemporary themes to it, even though it's set back in the 1800s. I think this is sort of like Eggers' dig, or what lies ahead for the US, and obviously with a certain 47 presidents about to take his seat again in the Oval Office. I think they're sort of playing on potentially with the chaos that might lie await, sort of pushing that sort of primary hatred amongst the population. And then when the people start fleeing, it's Orlok's minions who are actually attacking those who actually flee. I'm not going to say much more, Clotilde. I'll let you. What did you think of the film? Did you like it or didn't you like it? And what you thought of it?
I agree with you. I think it's really what you said, like a gothic horror. I think the sort of suspense and tension was done really, really well. Like the scene where we first see Nosferatu, I think is brilliant because it builds up this tension and then the way they portray him really lives up to that sort of hype. But then also throughout the film, there's always constantly like moments of tension. And I think that's really, really well done because it could have easily sort of like fell after the first reveal of Nosferatu or sort of when you figure out what's going to happen. But I think it very much keeps you on the edge of your seat until the very end for me. I also like, I'm not very good with horror films, so I had to look away at certain times because it was like, I thought it was quite scary. So I was like sort of looking, not looking. And that's, that's a good thing because it means the film really managed to sort of get into my head, get under my skin in that sense. I also think the acting is phenomenal. I, yeah, I think everyone involved is just so brilliant from like Lilly-Rose Depp, Nicholas Hoult, obviously Willem Dafoe, and Bill Skarsgård is a great Count Orlok. I think he's proven before that he can really do these characters that are like twisted and they're scary. But I think in this film he really like takes it up to another level even. And I have to say Lily-Rose Depp as well for me was a bit of a revelation. I admittedly haven't seen much of her. I never really thought of her as a great actress, if I'm being honest. But in this film, she really excels. Like she's embodying the role so well, and you can see that not just in like the delivery of the lines and the acting from like a sort of facial expression point of view, but she's really transformative in her body during the sort of possession moments, the way she sort of like uses certain movements. I thought that was brilliant, and I'm very happy with the performances. I think that's sort of stood out for me a lot. And also the really practicality of the sets, I think is what makes it so like unnerving and scary as well, because there's so much that is real, right? Like the rats were actual rats on set, and the pigeon. There's a famous scene with the pigeon. If you've seen it, you know.
Yeah,
But for a good portion of that scene, there is a real pigeon, and then it gets sort of like swapped for a fake one, obviously.
yeah.
But I think you can feel that reality and that sort of like practicality of the effects. very much feels true. It's not like a green screen or CGI, which I'm sure there are special effects in Nosferatu, but I think it creates a really eerie atmosphere because you can really see that what you're watching through the screen is something real. So I think that was a really powerful choice from the production design and from the director, and it does pay off to me as somebody who actually got scared um, while watching it. I'm not as familiar with Bram Stoker's Dracula, but I did watch the original Nosferatu when I was, and I thought it was quite interesting how this version of Nosferatu seems to go back to all the tradition and even the silent film that I think a lot of people forget about, and sort of incorporates a lot of these in the film, and it sort of pays homage to the tradition that Nosferatu and also vampire stories that have inspired it is. I think that's quite fascinating because it's sort of owning up to everything that came before it, recognizing the tradition behind it rather than, like doing a remake that wants to be different. I think this Nosferatu is really aware of like people's expectation and the films that came before it, which I think is not, it's not something to be taken for granted. And it's definitely part of the appeal of the whole movie, the fact that you can tell that the people behind it have such a level of respect and love for the story, right, that came before it. So whether that is, Dracula or the book itself or the silent movie, it all plays into this depiction of Nosferatu, and I think that's quite important. But I have to say, I really enjoyed it. I didn't think I would because, like I said, I do quite struggle with horror films.
Yeah.
But like you said, it's not like a jump scare, and I don't even think it's like too gory. Like it's quite. There are some moments, there are some moments of violence, but I think it's more the tension that you feel for however long it is. I think it's a couple of hours for its entire runtime, more than like the gory moments. For me, it was sort of like kind of sitting through that uncomfortable state of tension, which is exactly what I think the movie is meant to achieve. And yeah, I have to say I'm very happy with it. And overall, it's a great film, and I enjoyed it a lot more than I originally thought I would. So I think even if maybe like vampire films or horror films are not your thing, I do think Nosferatu has elements that everybody could appreciate despite like whether or not you're familiar with the source material, with the time period it says in. Obviously, in those cases, you would perhaps appreciate it more. But I think it's such a well-made film from a technical perspective that really anybody could find good reason to enjoy it, even if you get a little bit scared.
The thing is, as we mentioned in the last two episodes, 38 and 39, when we talked about horror, obviously you said you're not a fan of horror. I'm a fan of horror. I'll say a few things first. I didn't hate this film, but I didn't love it. Sort of going back to the sort of the sort of folklore of this, Eggers definitely went for the more rather than the sort of vampire. Obviously, the Bram Stoker's Dracula. And if anyone knows the sort of story, the Bram Stoker's family actually sued F.W. Murnau, who did the original, to because they said it seen it as a total rip-off of Dracula. Like Thomas, he's Harker's basically Harker in Dracula, and in Dracula, it's more set in England and rather in Germany. That's it. I think you will see a lot of similarities, but I think both of them have their own uniqueness to it. I actually reviewed Nosferatu, the original, away back in 2013. Eureka, Masters of Cinema, released it in a Blu-ray. I think they re-released it again as a 4K, but nearly 3 years ago, they released it again in cinemas for its 100th anniversary. And that is the ultimate film. You will find my review on thepeoplesmovies.com. So the folklore, as I said, is more sort of Roman gypsy, and there's also sort of criticism there as well. When you see him, when we do get to see him, he's sort of very much rat-like, as you mentioned about the rats, and the rats are all seen as the carriers of the disease, and I think that's very unfair and quite discriminatory against anyone who has any gypsy heritage. Also the original, you're right when you said about the original. There's a lot of nods to the original here. I mean, the original was created during the Weimar Republic, so this was a sort of very political turmoil time, and I think that's maybe where Eggers is taking possibly what's happening nowadays in America and playing on the sort of anxieties of the population. So obviously, the Weimar Republic fell apart because of one certain young man who nearly destroyed the world. That was Adolf Hitler. And sort of the plague of Wisborg is, you can see, is sort of like a sort of collapse of normalities, and Orlok sort of, to the people he's already been hypnotised on, if you like to say, offering them a way out. You can see he could be seen as this Hitler type figure because he offered many things to the population and never delivered them, and became one of the most notorious worst dictators in human society. You don't need me to explain. It's horrible. And so obviously it's also a metaphor of death. Also, going back to sort of modern things that this version does, I think he also tips to into the sort of mental health side of things, and the sort of the lack of understanding of things, and obviously the women's health, because we see Ellen and we see Anna at certain times, and they go through certain things that happen in the films, and obviously it's a time when it was a male-dominated area, especially in jobs of doctors and things. Everything was seen from a male perspective, and it was also a time when, if it was some mental health thing, they would just throw you in a cell and put you in a straitjacket and leave you to rot and forget about you, that type of era. If anything, I think in this film, you could probably say that for all the versions, the female characters are really just there for, I'm going to be very controversial here and just sort of say, all sort of veiled grooming, and they really are just for this objects of sexual desire, because he's seen as a more older, powerful man, and obviously see the power that he had. The scene that you really liked at the beginning, it was a very good scene at the opening scene. He took power of Ellen at the beginning, and obviously he's desiring her beauty and her youthful looks, of Ellen. And there's also, I think, some sort of trauma sort of deep in here as well, and it's I think leaves you very uncomfortable, and it's very sinister. And there was a point, and I think it might have been Willem Dafoe's character, who sort of says it's the women to blame for Orlok's desires. I mean, to me, that's I could have seen, is it gaslighting? I think they call it that type of that type of thing. Have you seen Zoe Kravitz's Blink Twice?
No, I really want to.
Yeah, when I was sort of thinking about it, when I was sort of writing the notes, I was sort of thinking about, you know what, Blink Twice, I play on the sort of power and the sort of male entitlement in there, and I think that you see that with Aaron Taylor Johnson's Harding character, and it suggests, obviously, something happens to his wife dies. They suggest something that he actually does after her death. I'm not going to get into too much details. I'll let people see it and let them see what they believe what that is. And it's something really horrible. I think you know what scene I'm talking about, Clotilde, when they get to the point they need to do something, And I think this is when the film sort of takes a sort of more dark, erotic tone. Because obviously when Thomas gets back from Wisborg and he's with his wife Ellen, and you can say they get very animalistic, You can say the same thing about Harding. A lot of people around the world, including fans, cinephiles, including critics, are calling it a masterpiece. It's not a masterpiece. As I said earlier, it's not a bad film either. The things that I think went really bad was it's such a long film. It's about 2.5 hours. So the pacing, I think, was really bad. And it was very slow at a point where I couldn't really enjoy it as much. And any sort of sense of dread that I was playing along with, it sort of evaporated when we got close to anything very interesting. And I found it very tedious as well. Story itself, I think, at times was, especially when it came from such an iconic source, I think at times this version was very undeveloped. And it left me disappointed at times. And I think with the character-wise, I think they forgot about the intro a lot of the characters, and it left you wondering, should I be cheering for them or should I be despising them, And I think thematically, it had many things to say, but it gave you very, very little in return. And that sort of, as I said, the 2.5 hour running time, it felt very monotonous, drag. Visually, I will say this is where Eggers did well. He captured it really well, and I think it captured the German expressionism, which was created at this time, and which this film is seen as a big essential film of the German film expressionism. There was a couple of scenes with very shoddy CGI. The scene that especially it got me was when they're returning. I'm not spoiling here, folks. If we do see anything, there might be an odd spoil here and there, but we don't do that deliberately. Occasionally we do apologise if we do slips, the tongue slips. It's the scene where they just get back to Wisborg and they are going up the is it a rowing boat or something? They're going up the river, and you can clearly see the CGI that they've gone in a green screen because the background felt really fake, which was a shame because there's so much else going for it, as in the practical surroundings, and when we see Thomas in the forest, and we see the people walking around the little town of Wisborg, which was actually somewhere outside of Prague in the Czech Republic, where it was actually filmed. I'm not going to say much more because I've got a couple of things to say at the end. Clotilde, I'm going to let you, if you want to sort of sum up what you think of the film, and then we'll go into what ratings maybe we give it.
I don't have much more to say except that I think the reason why I ended up liking it more than I thought is because I feel like I didn't have much expectation because, like I said, I'm not as familiar with all the sort of folklore and tradition behind it, although I did watch some of it. So I think it's obviously kind of coming from more of a casual, I think, fan perspective, and like somebody who's really into vampires or the whole tradition. So I think that obviously affects the viewing experience. But yes, overall I quite liked it. I think I especially like the production design and the acting. I think they really stood out for me and they sort of carried the film through. I think it can feel quite long at times, especially in the first act. But for me, it sort of like kind of in a way was the point because it felt like it was prolonging this whole of like tension. You kind of know where it's going, but it's really interesting to see how it gets there for me. And yes, overall, I gave it 4 stars out.
I thought the acting it was a bit wooden at times, and I only think Dafoe and McBurney were the only two that sort of came out with a head sigh. They were very campy and very fun performances, and their characters actually felt they were part of that time and were part of that type of film that this film was trying to be. I'm not going to say about the actors I thought were a bit wooden or anything. I'll leave it at that. But I think if you want to watch it, I'll definitely watch the original 1922 original, and I would even
Yeah,
watch the Klaus Kinski as Orlok's Werner Herzog's 1979 remake. And there's another film I'll actually say go and watch it because it's very underrated. And it's a film that actually stars Willem Dafoe, and that's a film I think for about 1990s. It's got some cast in it as well, and that's The Shadow of the Vampire, which I think is a better story, and it's all about the making of the film. And Willem Dafoe plays Orlok as the character, but there's a little thing there. Is he really Orlok or not? It's a nice little twist there. It's a fun little film. I'll definitely watch that. As an overall, as I said, didn't love it to the point to give it 4 stars or anything like that, or even more. There was enough in there for me to give some sort of enjoyment, and I will give it 3 stars. So there you have it, folks. That's Nosferatu. That is 4 stars and 3 stars. And the next and final film to be reviewed, episode 40 of the Chronicle, is Asif Kapida's 2073. Clotilde, would you like to tell us about the film and if you liked it or didn't like it?
absolutely. So 2073 starts in 2073, as you might have guessed.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a dystopian science fiction-y film at the beginning because it follows this woman called Ghost who lives underground in a very weird version of San Francisco, which is now the capital of the Americas. He's in hiding from the government, which has become very dictatorship-like. and there's no space for freedom of speech or disagreement. Everybody's very highly controlled by modern technologies such as like face recognition, and she's not subject to that because she's hiding basically underground to escape this. And it's obviously a very big risk for her and everybody that chooses this lifestyle, and her family. Even at the very beginning of the film, she says like, there's a big risk, that she's deciding to live her life like this. So at the beginning of the film, she's sort of inviting the audience to look back at how we got there. This dystopian version of 2073 in the way that the director, Asif Kapida, imagines it. And that's the point when the film becomes a documentary, which is really fascinating to me. So through news footage and interviews, all of that, it analyzes basically our contemporary era and how the thesis that the film would suggest is that we're going towards this dystopic future we've seen at the beginning, and we sort of keep going back to. So the scope is, I think, huge. There's, a part set in London in 2016. There's another part in India, we live in 2012, another one in China. So there's basically examples from all over the world that the director finds to point out how certain political movements and elections and certain things in the development of technology have led us to this moment that he sees as sort of like pivotal for the future. So it's sort of telling us if we don't stop, the way things are going, we are going to end up in the 2073 that the film is showing us. So it's talking about so many things. Like it's talking about the environment, it's talking about social media, it's talking about like the rise of far right dictatorships, or not far right governments that are quite similar to dictatorships. And I think it's very fascinating how it's mixing everything together, as well as it's going back between documentary and science fiction. It's a lot more than just sort of like present and past or present and future even. To me, it's like it feels like even an innovation of the documentary genre. I know a lot of people didn't like this film, but I personally, I think one of the few big fans because it's so rare to see a documentary really innovate the filmmaking and the way documentaries are made. I think documentaries as a genre is incredible, but it can be quite repetitive, when the same props and techniques are used, such as like the voice of God narration and voiceovers and stuff like that. I think 2073 uses all the documentary techniques, but in such a new context. And it's incredibly exciting to see. And I think the sort of criticism, which, is fair and I think justified at times, I think the scope is way too big and it's really trying to, in a way, do too much for a 2-hour movie. There's no way you can tackle all these issues properly when so many and so much like they're so important to our daily lives that you would need one documentary just to explore one even. But I think a lot of the criticism stems from the fact that this documentary is sort of like facing us with a very uncomfortable reality. I think, it's very hard to accept that perhaps does have a point in saying, we need to be careful. We might be going towards something dystopic, something that many of us would not want to live in. And, it's a thesis, I think, that the director is explaining in this documentary. And you might disagree with some of his points and some of his arguments or with the thesis overall. But I think that doesn't take away from the really impressive, at least ambition behind the film. I think it's very rare to see a film in general and a documentary more specifically sort of do so much. I think it's very brave to try and connect very different time periods, very different regions of the world, very different countries, and even cultural moments. And while I'm not sure it's entirely successful because when you do so much and you have time, you can't go in depth. But I do think it's necessary in the sense that it's sort of, to me, it sort of points out that we live in an interconnected world, right? Especially now with social media. Obviously there are national borders and stuff, but it sort of feels less relevant when we're so interconnected. What is, the election in the US affect all of us in Europe. And obviously we are deeply affected by the politics of every country around us, now more than ever because we're so close to it. The information can reach us within seconds. And that's something that the documentary really made me think about. I think for all its criticism about like social media and technology and the way technology is sort of like controlling people's lives, it does use that sort of aesthetic, which is quite fascinating. There is so much that really comes from social media in the film. And I think that that's really clever because, we can't deny the role that social media has, not just in our daily lives, but in politics and, real life issues. So yeah, I did quite like it. If not for like how well it does maybe everything, it's extremely tricky. But for having had the courage to undergo such an ambitious project, it's even just thinking about like the scope of this documentary and the way it mixes like two genres that are not associated together. It feels impossible, even though I've seen it. So I thought that was very impressive. I'm sure it's not his most, his best film, but I do think it's something that I personally have never seen before, and I think it's something that is going to define the documentary genre and documentary filmmaking because it's sort of giving it a new face to me.
I liked it as well. I really did like it as well. I liked how, as you said, blending documentary and sci-fi drama. The lady that plays Ghost is Samantha Morton. People know if like the likes of Minority Report. She said was one of her more recent films. The Walking Dead. She played one of the villains, notorious villains, in there for a couple of seasons. It is a bit of an oddity, and as I said, I enjoyed it to a certain extent. You can clearly see, I think it's inspired by the 1962 film for Chris Marker, Ligeti. There's a lot of influence in there, and obviously that had big influence on 12 Monkeys as well. As you said, I think it also depends your views on the environments and even your politics and how much you might believe or enjoy or take in the message that Kapida's giving you in this film. I mean, Kapida's done some truly great documentaries. I mean, when Back to Black came out there last year, people were saying they want to see some truly Amy Winehouse. His documentary Amy's probably the best. He also did the documentary on Ayrton Senna, and then he did the documentary on Diego Maradona, which I really, really loved. Diego Maradona, as I call, is the patron saint of Scottish football. All I say is 1986, the handball. And Asif Kapida actually replied back to me in X and Twitter, and he really liked that comment. The Diego Maradona one, that's all about how much he was a god in Naples because he played for Napoli at the time. I've said to people who are a bit iffy about it, approach it as if it's a what if scenario. I mean what if scenario. Marvel Comics for years had a what if comic, like what if Doctor Doom or was a good person, Wolverine was a villain, that sort of thing, because the world is very toxic, and depending on your political views, you may get ripped apart in certain places. So this, as I said, the terrifying about it is this could happen in some certain senses already happen because you see it through the video content that are shown. Because I think Clotilde, a lot of the scenes where you see people underground, I believe that was a lot of the early scenes that we were seeing when the Ukraine-Russia conflict started. And there was a lot of the Ukrainian people who were all going under the buildings. I think that's where they use the scene like as if she was walking through. There's a scene she's walking through tunnels and that, and I believe that's where they're using it. It was very well done how they done that. You don't really truly see what they are, but the footage is on there. She's walking through that, and it just shows you how much we're starting to let companies and political figures influence us, as in humanity, as in the land we live in, all for the name of profit, and how they abuse the population to get more money out of us. So you get that sort of side of things. You get the social media side of things. Obviously, Twitter, Elon Musk has that, and many people see that as a tool for sort of the right wing side of things, and people see Blue Skies as sort of more left and liberal side of things. But richer or poorer, in reality now, people are starting to see if you're middle class or you're working class, everything we seem to do, we're getting poorer and poorer, and we seem to be helping the rich become more richer, you know. Sorry, that's me getting my little political side thing out there. But before we know it, I think we're starting to get restricted. We're actually seeing that even in what we are doing now. The website, the People's Movies, and any other film websites people go to, there's certain trailers will come in. A bit, I believe maybe with the Nosferatu, the film we just reviewed before this, some of the trailers come in saying, this is, if you want to watch the full trailer, you must go to YouTube to actually watch it. And that's sort of do with censorship, you know. But you can go to the American one and watch, and I could put it on my website and it worked fine. That type of thing, you know, that's it's starting to happen. And obviously the TikTok thing, because it's a Chinese social media tool. People seeing it as a tool of propaganda. There's other social medias out there that people say they're this or that, you know. I am not going to go into any sort of political stance or anything here, even though I'm mentioning a lot of political things here. I think everyone's got a right to a political stand, even if that is a right or wrong political stance, you know. It's just everything. And then obviously, you know, if you've seen all the sort of news stories, especially in America, with these, I think, drones and that, or they're calling them UAPs, that are appearing in the sky around bases, important building places around the US. Have you seen all that in the news, Clotilda? You know, with the drones?
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, and I think that shows how like relevant the film is
Yeah, it
because
is.
it
Go ahead.
was made like obviously came out well, I saw it in Venice. So I think that was the world premiere, like September 2024. Obviously must have been made like before. And yet I think every time you see the news there is something that can remind you of it. So
Yeah,
that's in a way very scary, but also makes it more interesting.
yeah, it does. It does. And it's you can go into YouTube and you can see there's 1,000,001 videos people saying it's this, it's them, it's aliens, it's the government, it's doing it,
Hmm.
you know, that type of thing, you know. And then you hear news stories of statements going to these news channels for the government saying, leave them alone, they're doing nothing. Makes you wonder, are they really just up there for at some stand to spy on everyone now? You know, that sort of security state that's just going into that sort of Big Brother as well. I think we're already been in that for a long, long time, you know. It lets you think that sort of thing. And it was, and how the social media has brought a sort of hatred to journalism. I mean, there's been a lot of controversies with journalisms, you know, online and television and that, you know. It's hard to, who do you believe, all this checking. And then obviously now with Donald Trump about to come in power, we've got Facebook stopping all the fact checking, and they're going for some that I think they're going some very similar to X and Twitter, where as they're calling it, more open. You know, I think they're just trying not to get in Donald Trump's bad books rather than going, no, that isn't right, no, that's okay, blah blah blah. You know, I think it's just so terrifying. They films, well, I'm a bit older. Films and they books that we read years ago, maybe our parents read, our older siblings have read or watched in television, are all actually come to true. And I say it all the time, RoboCop, all the things that are happening in RoboCop are actually coming true. These conflicts that are happening around the world, it's so the big companies that make the weapons are all coming more powerful. They're getting influencing governments, you know, and products here and that. How are products, the things in the Simpsons, you know, it's so terrifying, but at the same time, it's so difficult to actually go believe, is that true or is that true? What should I believe in and what should I do? Should I protest or am I going to get into trouble? You know, which this film tries to do. I will say it's a very ambitious film. Like compared to, we talked about a certain film in the worst films, the Megapolis, which, give us credit, was ambitious, but it failed in every single way. This film doesn't 100% get it right, as you I totally agree with. At the same time, you might not agree with everything he's saying, but Kapida is doing it. He's presenting, like, here's the points, decipher yourself what you think. However, if they are true, decide quickly. If you don't, it's over. We might be
Hmm.
living the way Ghost might has been living, you know, living at the scraps and that. That was that for the all these science fiction films where the rich and the wealthy, the elite are living up in space in some luxurious spaceship or station, and we're all down here suffering all the things that are happening. We're all walking about with masks on, and unable to breathe, hardly anything to eat, and it's just turmoil down here, and that's what fascinated me. Don't get me wrong, it's not the perfect movie, but it's amazing. As I've said before, films are there to get you talking, maybe get you start discussing things that need to be discussed. I think this is one of those films, 2073. So, Clotilde, what is your sort of final thoughts on it, and what sort of rating would you give it?
I think it's a very uncomfortable film, but it's meant to be. Like it has to be a hard watch.
Yeah,
Um, because it has to be something that makes you uncomfortable. It makes you scared even, and maybe makes you even question if you agree with it at all. But I think whether or not you do, it's really not the point of the film. I think it's meant to spark that debate and make us really think about this, because I think it's easier to sort of ignore it and hope it goes away. But it's really important to question, all of everything that the film invites us to think about. I really think for me, it's one of the best documentaries I've seen this year, or this year, no, but the past year, yes.
yeah, yeah.
So it's 2024. This year would be a little bit too early to say. But yes, I ended up giving it 4 stars as well.
Yeah, I really, really did enjoy it as well. It says I think it's an existential piece of work, reminding us that the democracy is potentially under threat. Reminds us, dealing with, obviously, if you believe in the climate crisis or not, the rise of the far right. We're now moving into a sort of surveillance state, and there's also genocide there. There's also the threat of AI, which a lot of people are terrified of if this will go, with AI as well. And it's
Mm.
it's as I said, it's asking the question, here's the facts, or if you don't believe they're facts, if you do believe they're facts, what we're going to do about it if we don't? We won't be around anymore. We'll plunge into despair type thing, If you think they're lies, what is the truth? No, it's even asking that at the same time, what you think of that, As an overall mark, I'll probably give it just slightly less, 3.5, because I like the message, but it just gave a lot of stuff, but never gave you answers to it. And I think that just sort
Mm.
of made me give it a little less mark. So yeah, you have it, folks. 2073. We give it 4 stars and 3.5 stars. And that's your wrap, folks. That was your episode 40 of The Chronicle. Thank you very much for joining us in this episode. Both films, the Nosferatu and 2073, are now in UK cinemas. They might also be in cinemas outside the UK. Just like here in the UK and Ireland, please look at your local listings to find out if the cinema near you is showing it. As for 2073, you might have to look a wee bit deep to find a cinema that's shown it, because it is a very limited screening. Maybe suggest you head over to Altitude Films, who are the people who are releasing the film here in the UK, to find out. You can follow the Chronicle, myself, and the People's Movies over at Blue Sky at the People's Movies. Facebook, X and Twitter at The People's Movie. Instagram over at The People's Movies. We're also on Pinterest at TPM_UK and at YouTube at The People's Movies 1. The chat may continue over at The Chronicle Take 2, so stay tuned on social media and The People's Movies for future episodes. Another way you can find out about future episodes and what we're doing over at The People's Movies is sign up for an email newsletter. You find the link over at the website. You can also show your support for the Chronicle and the People's Movies by buying us a coffee. The link is over at the website. You can also share the podcast and future podcasts and previous podcasts on social media with your friends and family. And if you're listening, if you're one of those very popular web podcast sites, please do rate us, because we are a small podcast, and sharing and rating it does help more people find the podcast. It helps with algorithms and things like that. If you're wondering where Clotilde is, apologies to Clotilde. I accidentally decided to stop recording and say goodbye, and so I've just decided to do it myself. So apologies, Clotilde, for that. But thank you very much for joining us here on episode 40, and we'll be speaking soon on episode 41. And to yourselves, thank you very much for joining us. Until the next time, enjoy the movies.